You're listening to In My Humble Opinion with Maxilia Robinson and Charles Lewis, only on 101.3 Jams.
And we're back. You're tuned in to In My Humble Opinion on 101.3 Jams, home of Cheryl Underwood Radio and the Rise and Grind Morning Show. Of course, you got Miss Max.
Sir Charles.
And Razor. Our guest for this hour is none other than Leontyne Peck. How are you, Miss Peck?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good. Miss Peck is a family historian. Mm-hmm. You have some ties to the Madison plantation, is that right?
Yes, Montpelier.
Okay, Montpelier. Why don't you give our listeners just a little bit of background of what it is that you do?
Okay. I consider myself a family historian, genealogist, and I've been doing this really for most of my life. Since I was about 10 years old, I've been interested in family history. But in terms of Montpelier and the Charlottesville area, it's been about 15 years since I moved here and learned that my family on my father's side was from Madison County. My father's family, they were the Clays, and they lived in Kriglersville in Madison County.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was my initial connection here.
Yeah. And you know, Max and I were talking about just the right way to introduce you because you do so many good works. Now, some people may have seen you on PBS and not even know it because this is radio; they can't see you. So you want to tell them about the feature that you were on PBS?
Oh, I would be happy to. I was so excited, and again, this was with my work with Montpelier because I'm part of the descendant community, and Montpelier has done great work in involving the descendants. And again, as I said, my family was from Madison and Orange counties, and so as part of that process of interviewing Charlene Hunter Galt, who was just really an icon in America, she came to Montpelier to visit and to interview many of the descendants, and I was selected. I was one of the individuals who she interviewed, and as well as Mary Alexander, she interviewed both of us, and it was great, a great interview. It was on PBS. So we encourage people to go to visit the Mere Distinction of Color. That is a permanent exhibition at Montpelier.
Now, I feel like you're being a little humble, though.
Okay.
Because family historian is one way, but I was sharing with you and Mr. Peck that's here with you that the first time that I met you guys were actually at, I think it was the first Black Love Symposium that the BPN had. And our listeners know very well about the Black Professional Network.
Yeah.
And so you guys were there sharing your, beautiful love story, the ups and downs of marriage and what have you. So you had that, part going. And then also recently, and I have to share this story. Okay. One way that I could have introduced you as well is as my cousin.
Yeah, that's right. We are cousins. We are.
Come to find out. And Max, you know how this came to be. So the wife was down at the Paramount for the I think it was the Ali dancers, right?
Yes, it was a legacy for Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, right. And so Mrs. Peck was there speaking, and she was talking about her lineage work and how she was a Clay, and from Madison. Right? And guess what, Max? on my maternal side,
we got some Clays,
that's right. That's right. So so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but my great grandfather was the same Clay family.
The same Clay family from Madison County, and I have been blessed, and I found so many connections in this area. My family moved from Madison County to West Virginia in the 1920s and 30s. And so I didn't know that my family was from Madison County until I moved to this area about 15 years ago. So each Clay that I meet, I automatically claim them because it's a small world now, and it was an even smaller world back then. So I actually did, I met Charles's wife at the Paramount. I gave a presentation on my connection to Cassius Marcellus Clay, the Emancipationist. So I have both European as well as Charles being related to Senator Henry Clay, to the European Clays. And we know from history that many African Americans who endured and who are descendants from the transatlantic slave trade. We share both African as well as European heritage. That's just a fact.
And now the clays that migrated, so to speak, from this area over towards West Virginia, even Kentucky, right?
Yes.
So the Ali piece that ties in. You want to? Can you mention that?
I can. The Ali piece, which is very, we always want to be related to someone famous, and so with Cassius Clay, who is Muhammad Ali, I always wanted to be related to him, and so
You wanted to be related.
I wanted to be, to Layla and all of them. And as it turns out, no, we have not found yet any of the DNA, and really that's what helps us, to know what is truthful and what isn't. Is that we haven't found that connection of us being biologically connected, but it's still the same family, still owned by the same family. But what is ironic is that I am, the cousin of Cassius Marcellus Clay, the Emancipationist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You see that?
Yeah, I do.
You know I'm going right there.
Yeah, I did.
Got hands raised like that.
So we are the greatest.
Pause on you.
Let me ask you this question. In genealogy, when you were looking up people, was there ever a time you came across a name where you said, Lord, please don't let me be kin to them?
I have, yes. Yeah. Well, what is funny is I grew up and I'm very proud of my roots. And I actually grew up in a little town in West Virginia called Piedmont, West Virginia. And if you've heard of the scholar Dr. Henry Louis Gates, we call him Skip. He is also from Piedmont, West Virginia. And so, and he has a very popular television show that comes on called Finding Your Roots. So we're from the same area. So in that particular community, just like any small community. And I always say this, I was very fortunate to meet my husband because he lived in the neighboring community. I couldn't date or marry anyone in Piedmont because they were all my cousins. So you have to expand, your love interest pool as well.
So what was your motivation to start all this? I know you said that you started looking into being interested in history and whatnot when you were 10 years old. So what was your motivation for this? Is it lack of knowing your family or?
A combination of things, but primarily what happened with me is that growing up in this small community, we were the only family, meaning my grandparents and their children, who had the surname Clay.
Okay.
And so my father didn't have any known cousins in the community. There was no one Clay. And so I would ask him, as growing up, were your cousins, Daddy? And he would always say, oh, we don't have any, or they died. We'd say all the people died. And that was always his standard, answer. So I kept asking and kept asking. And, when my first daughter was born, my grandmother, my father's mother, came to visit us. We were in Washington, D.C., and that was the first time that I learned the names of my great-great-grandparents because I was filling out my daughter's baby book. Had no idea. She didn't tell me where they were born. She just said Virginia. So I didn't know that it was Madison County. So my interest has been, since I was a young girl. And then, and I always share this story, and I know that we don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of detail, but I will say that those ancestors and those cousins and those relatives that my father said had died, well, they hadn't died. They just stayed in Madison County and in Culpeper. And
they all did.
They all died. They're dead. And so we were able, my father at the time, he was ill. He had an autoimmune disorder. And so I didn't really want to press him on answering questions and things for me. I didn't want, to aggravate him.
Right.
But we found a lead. And I had a very wonderful mentor. His name was was Julian Burke, who was the head of the genealogy group here. And he helped me to find a lot of my relatives, but the one that he helped me find, it led and opened up all these doors, was a relative by the name of IMHO Clay.
Okay.
Now, not many people have that name. And IMHO worked near Culpeper, and we went to go, my youngest daughter and I, we went to go visit his place of work. He had no idea that we existed. And when we found him, he looked exactly like my father and my grandfather. So we knew that we had hit a home run.
Right.
And that actually gave my father, I believe, some longevity in his life, because all of a sudden I found his cousins.
Right.
And he was so excited. And we had a big family reunion in West Virginia.
Wow. So I think we're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, I'd like to hear about the digs that you've done at Monticello and how that experience went and what things you found. If that's
great.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay?
absolutely.
All right, family. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Jams.
That's right. This is In My Humble Opinion, and we are speaking with Leontyne Peck, family historian. Before the break, Ms. Peck, we talked about the digs that you've done at James Madison's Montpelier. And so I'd like you to just elaborate on that experience and tell us, some of the things that you found.
Okay. I'd like to say, first of all, that it's a great experience, and it's open to the public to participate in the dig. The only thing that they need to do to get more information would be go to Montpelier's website, because it is open to the public. Let me say that, tell you a little story of how I got involved with it.
Okay.
I serve on the President's Commission on Slavery and the University for the University of Virginia, as well as Dr. Matt Reeves, who is at Montpelier and is a director of archaeological services at Montpelier. So we were in a meeting, and Matt and I were at the same desk. We were, working on the same things, and he asked me if I knew anything about archaeological dig at Montpelier, and I didn't, so he elaborated a little bit, and then he asked me if I wanted to volunteer and come out and do the dig. And I told him, I said, hell no, I am not interested in coming out and working for free. It's a setup. No. And so he explained a little more, and I said, I am an adventuresome type of person, and I'm interested, obviously, in family history and archaeology, and I would be, interested. And you stay on the property. It's very intense. The archaeologists who are there in training, and people come really from all over the United States and participate in this dig. So I was honored to be there. I did not expect to find much about my family there, but I always say that the Almighty had another plan for me. That's what I say, because when I went on the dig, I had my tools there. We started digging. I started finding things, learning things about myself. But for me, it became a spiritual experience, as So there are many things that we found, and they put us in teams. But what I found that was the most meaningful and significant to me was that I found a pipe. And the pipe was pretty much intact, and the front of it, and remember that the digging that we were doing is in the South Yard, and that's where the domestic enslaved workers lived. So what we were digging were artifacts that they had used. So the last person who touched that connected with my spirit. So when I dug up that pipe and saw it, and then you have to make sure that the archaeologists on site come and see, and so they looked at it. And they said, it has a Masonic symbol. And so this is why it's important for people from a lot of different backgrounds to be involved in these digs, because the staff there assumed that it was probably belonged to Madison or one of their friends, one of their white friends, certainly not an enslaved person. And so because of my background, knowing about the Prince Hall Masons, and I have members of my family who are Masons and Eastern Stars, I said, well, you might want to look at this, because it could have belonged to one of the enslaved individuals. And, and as it turned out, they went and Montpelier did the research, and it probably did belong to one of the enslaved individuals there. So that pipe took on a totally different meaning. Now, when I unearthed the pipe, and I tell this story multiple times because it's very meaningful to me, when I first touched the pipe, I thought of my grandfather. My grandfather was from Madison County. his name was Willie Clay, and he always smoked a pipe. And so all the pictures that I had with him, and again, he lived in Madison County, was born there, but lived in West Virginia. But he's known in our community as Mr. Willie Clay, the man who smoked the pipe. So, yeah, and so when I touched it, I thought immediately of him. And it was almost like he had a cherry tobacco. And when I touched that pipe, it was almost like I could smell it. And so it brought tears to my eyes. And then at that point in time, I realized that I was not just to be at Montpelier for a one-time event. This was something the ancestors were saying, we need you to come and tell our story.
Yes. And
we need other people to come and tell our story. So for me, finding the pipe, I also was able to find a marble. And the staff there, the professional nurses, they kind of laugh now because they say every time you come, Leontyne,
you finding all the marbles.
You're finding all the stuff intact. People have been digging here in the dirt for hours and hours, and you show up with your little shawl on, and it's like they're underneath the earth. And here she comes. Let's give her all the goodies. So,
it's spiritual.
It's spiritual. It's very spiritual, and I feel connected to the land. And I don't feel that way everywhere I go, but at Montpelier I feel as though my ancestors were there. The ancestors of my friends were there. It's a place that I feel inspired. That they can't tell their story. We have to tell their story.
That's right.
Do you know what part of Africa, I'm sorry, Charles, what part of Africa your family is from?
According to the DNA, and I actually encourage people to go back beyond 500 years. And the reason is that most of us who do the DNA, whether it's 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they will take you back maybe 400 to 500 years. And many of us, including myself, are from Benin, Togo, Ghana, Nigeria. And so that's where my DNA says that I'm from. And the enslaved people who were at Montpelier, they were from Benin and they were Igbo. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but in Stanton at the Frontier Museum, there is an Igbo village there. And I actually went there a couple of years ago and went through a naming ceremony and recovered my name. And the Igbo chiefs come from Africa and give you your name. And it's a very emotional journey. And I encourage people to do that. So having said that, the 500-year mark, many of us came from West Africa, from the same villages. But when we look at the dynamics of our DNA, and my brother and I both did it, and we also go back to the pharaonic lines. So we go to Ethiopia and to Egypt, like many of us. But you have to go back, a couple of more 100 years.
And you know what? I thought about especially the Egyptian part. Like when it comes to architecture, but even mathematics, and like cradle in civilization. When you think about Ethiopia, and I think about that, because it really struck me when you made the comment about finding the Mason marking, and then there being surprise, like shock and awe that that could possibly have come from someone of African descent.
Absolutely.
Forgetting that quite a bit of things.
Civilization. We created the civilization.
Exactly.
We were the Masons. We built the pyramids. So it really encourages people to go out and research, especially people who are descendants of the enslaved, because I don't know about everyone, but I know that in my experience, when I was in elementary school, the first chapter that they started teaching was just about slavery.
That's right.
But if they had started teaching that we built the pyramids, that we were kings, that we were queens, that we were princes, that we were all of this and beyond, we would have a better understanding of our history and to connect the dots. And I think that's what's happening today, is that we are getting a better education about our history.
That's one thing that I've learned about slavery they didn't just take like fathers, daughters, stuff like that. They took scientists, doctors, archaeologists.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
the part that they don't talk about right there.
No, they don't. And I always try to, when I'm speaking about the institution of slavery, I will say the institution of slavery, but we weren't slaves, we were enslaved.
There you go.
And that makes a big difference. Yes, they took who our chemists were and our midwives and our doctors, all of those started on the continent of Africa. And now I am glad to know that there's a resurgence. But there's also people community-wide, whether you're black or white, we want to know the truth. This is one of the reasons why I really emphasize family structure and family history.
Yeah.
I'm able, as an individual, I'm very blessed in that my family, even despite slavery, was able to stay intact. And we know that is the cornerstone of civilization. If you take the father or the mother away, then you destroy the family structure. So that's what we have to do now. We have to rebuild our identities. We have to keep our family intact to build strong communities.
Can I ask you a question?
Surely.
How do we do that since the government has tried to interject themselves and become the man of the black family?
We have to, as one of the things that I think that we have to do is not believe a lot of their propaganda. Despite what they say, we as the black community, we have to make sure that our children are educated from the time they hit the planet about who they are, their identity, and to protect them. I always say, if we look at other people's cultures, whether it's people from India or Korea, when they come here, they keep their families intact.
True.
Yeah.
We used to have that too. And we did have the government. We did have Jim Crow. We had a lot that was against us, and we still do. Let's not, be naive. But we as individuals, we have to be selective and proactive about keeping our families strong. We've had families that have been multi-generational. That's important to still sustain that, and especially our black men. We have to support our black men. This society tried to destroy the black man. We cannot allow that any longer. So if it means that you make a sacrifice to help a neighbor, then you do that, because that's what our family did. And I will say something. I had wonderful grandparents, but my grandmother, who was from Madison County, her rule in the family was that every person that's connected to me is always my family and will never be homeless. We sometimes don't follow those principles from the old people. So, there were times that in my grandmother's house, there were like 18 of us living in the same house. That was not uncommon. But now people have mansions and they won't even let one person move into the house.
Two is too many.
Two is too many. We have to stop that. We have to share and we have to build our network. We have to rebuild it and sustain it.
Yeah, and I think this conversation can go on and on. So you have a little more time, right?
I do.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So please stick with us, family. Don't want to miss it. We're gonna get to all the questions and topics with Miss Leontyne Clay Peck.
Telephone number 434-422-9101. Call us with your question.
And IMHO 101 Jams Online. We'll be right back.
Humble Opinion with Maxilia Robinson and Charles Lewis. Only on 101.3 Jams.
What about getting out of the rat race? How about establishing a legacy for you and your family? We live in a land of opportunity, and it's knocking at your door right now. Stephen Davis Enterprises recruits motivated individuals looking to make a change for themselves and others. Entrepreneurialism is alive and well. Is it alive in you? If so, contact them at 915-422-6842 or follow them on Twitter at Legacy in Action.
You're listening to In My Humble Opinion with Maxilia Robinson and Charles Lewis. Only on 101.3 Jams.
IMHO 101 Jams. Sir Charles.
It's Max.
And this is
I lost my voice on the miss part.
It's all good. We know who you are.
Excuse me, everybody.
We know who he is. But if you're just now tuning in to us, we have been talking to Miss Leontyne Clay Peck. She is a family historian and so much more. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thank you to Mr. Peck as well for coming along and being such a great support. Because I know a good man when I see one.
He's a good man.
Yeah, you ain't joking. I shook Mr. Peck's hand. He shook my whole body. I said, "Lord, this a man's man here."
So to follow up on what we were just talking about, one of the questions that did come up is, the contrast to what you were saying, because you mentioned some good things that you're able to find by having a diverse group, there at places like Montpelier for the digs. But now let's bring it home a little bit. Now, what about those times? I'm curious if you've experienced like maybe someone who thought they may have wanted to find out more about the heritage and lineage, and then they found out like that great granddaddy wasn't
that can
all
happen.
He was cracked up to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, what can happen, and I caution people about doing their DNA. I tell them in the very beginning what they should do is do the paperwork, do the research, write it down, and go with that, because that's your history and that's your story. Now, when you do the DNA, it may tell another history and story. So I caution people to say, be prepared for anything. Maybe your father wasn't your father, and that will show up. It
My
did.
leg went weak when she said that.
Because
My dad,
So you wonder why, where'd you get those green eyes from? That was the milkman that was coming around here. And it happens. So I tell people, the best source for getting information are your neighbors, because your neighbors will tell you the truth, especially if they've had a spat with your family. But be comprehensive and get as much so that you won't be surprised, because it has happened.
So before you go to Ancestry.com, go to your neighbor.
Go to your neighbor. Say, do you know anything I should know that Mama did or Daddy did?
for free 99.
And it might cost you a little something, but at least you won't be surprised, because your family won't tell you, but the neighbor will. The neighbor will tell you. I've had a couple of situations, but one that comes to mind is a lady contacted me, and this was on my mother's side of the family, and she contacted me, and she was looking for military records for her relative, and the records kept pulling up, and she kept, because I'm very much involved, online in these sources, and she kept seeing my name and my history pop up, and so on those resources, your picture is really little, so you can't really tell the image of the person. And so she found me and called me and said, now I'm looking for my relative. Last name was Redmond, last name was Spiller, and you keep popping up and you look like you're black to me. And I said, well, the last time I put my lipstick on, I was black. So she said, but I'm white. So she said, I don't see how you can keep popping up. And so I said, okay, tell me the name of your relative. And she did. And as it turned out, I knew the history of her relative. Yeah. He was my great-great-uncle from West Virginia. He went into the Navy. He was very light-skinned, and he was able to pass. So he passed for white, and she found out. So I said, now, that doesn't make you black. Your culture's not black. You grew up as a white woman. Now, you have some black DNA, if we want to call it that, but you don't have to change your life. I am your relative, but I grew up as an African-American woman. You're growing up as a white woman. So we can be cousins. We can be friends, whatever. That's your choice. And so she said, I never thought about it in that way. And so we still are very close. It was a couple years ago. And then she said, well, I have another relative who's ill, and it would kill him if he found out that he was black. So I said, well, you could push the button down and tell him. And I was or don't tell him. I'm not not going to call him up and tell him. But these are the kind of real life situations that it's more with white people finding out that they're black than us, because we already know.
Yeah.
And
You should have sent me, Miss Peck. I'd have went in there and hugged him and gave him a kiss on the cheek.
Yeah. So the truth is I don't know if she ever told him. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I didn't ask her.
Yeah.
So
Now, let me ask you about that part, because I feel like generationally it happens in its own way, as far as those who don't want to to recognize that part of the history, and it could backfire on you as well. What I mean by that is that, so you have some in the older generation who may have been so light skinned to where they could pass, as being white, to make their life easier,
they did,
so to speak, right? But then nowadays too, I have my opinions about it, but do you fear that too many people are talking about no longer seeing race? Because it scares me sometimes. Got to remind my son sometimes that prejudice, racism still exists.
It does.
Like you may accomplish A, B, and C, but at the same time, there's still going to be people out there who are going to have motives against you, and odds are still stacked against you. So do you fear that people are caring less about their heritage?
I think that in terms of people caring less about discrimination against people, I think we need to move in a more positive manner. But I also agree with you that we have to be realistic. That it's still going to take time. It's still going to take a process. But I look at it like this: that race is something really was a political construct. Now, genetics and your culture are not. Because, and I've said this quote before, and people kind of laugh when I say it, but it's true that black people come in all colors, even white. Yeah. But white people only come in white.
Hey, preach.
So if we see someone who looks like a Vanessa Williams, or it's very light skinned, or someone who looks like Lupita Nyong'o, they're still sisters. They're still we still share the same cultural values. But in this society, I don't think that we can dismiss it and say, okay, we're all going to have this happy moment. We still have to educate and teach our children about the importance of our culture, but also about the dangers that they could encounter in a culture that's not what I would call truly evolved. We still have a lot of work to do.
So to piggyback off of what Charles just asked you, what is the significance of us knowing our history? Because some of us just quite frankly don't care.
This is what I think about culture, is that if you don't know it, it's dangerous, because people can use your culture and history against you if you don't know it.
That's right.
We need to know our culture. Just like when we were speaking earlier about slavery, and then the history books started in the 1800s, but we were the first people on the planet.
That's right.
That's important for us to know. But if we are not, and they need to know, our children need to know that our ancestors were killed for learning how to read and write. Because there's power in knowledge, and you can only get that knowledge by learning how to read and write and acquire books. So that's important to know.
And real quick, the one thing that gets me about that the most too is that because people forget the perspective part and how much that means, how impressionable people can be when it comes to that. Like people don't get the significance of like the Black Panther movie, but it being such a strong storyline, some people look at that and be like why y'all making such a big deal about it? Or the 44th president being identifying as a black man.
Exactly.
So you have all those kind of things. Then even back to the church, I feel that it's done a lot of damage on us as a people if you are told that who you're worshiping has blonde hair and blue eyes.
That's exactly right. And I'm one of those individuals that I grew up in Sunday school just like, most African Americans, most people. And even at an early age, I challenged it. And I wrote about it, and I told my father, I was probably like 8 years old, and I went to my father and said, why is the man in the church, why doesn't he look like us?
I got a good question.
And that was, and he said that's, just ignore the picture. He looked more he looked like us.
Yeah. I got a good question for you. Okay. We talked about the digs that you found out in Montpelier, but Max and Charles did a show called The Descendants Show where they brought up Sally Hemings. How does that correlate with what you're talking about, like the digs and finding and the people not wanting to recognize that somebody might have been black or somebody might have been white, because they had a big fight about that, about who was Thomas Jefferson's lineage, right?
Right, that's right. And also, my family is connected to Monticello as well. Okay. And through the Redmonds and the family, through my mother's side of the family. So, if your family's been here for a long time, then, the odds are you're going to be related to a lot of people. But, again, that goes back to the theory, the flawed theory of white supremacy. Because Sally Hemings, with her ancestry, was probably more European looking than African looking. But she was still an enslaved woman. So it will cause controversy, but the fact remains that this woman had children with Thomas Jefferson, and those descendants are among us now. So I'm always thinking about spiritually and where the Most High wants us to go. In 2019 will be the 400th anniversary, and there will be a celebration in the Hampton Roads area. I want people to really pay attention to those dates because it's significant. The world is changing, and it's not by accident that you have the events happening in South Africa with the land, the movie Black Panther. People are beginning to wake up, and this is really it seems small. Some of these things seem small, but they're not. They're all coming together. We're connecting the dots. And so for those people, whether you're white or black or Asian or whatever category you may be in, it's time to wake up to the truth.
Thank you, Ms. Peck, for your time. We really appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much.
Sharing your wisdom with us.